Thank you very much for reading. And please, can you keep that passage open, although we are going to be turning to and fro a little bit today. Let me explain today's sermon, why it's different from our usual practice. We're going to do a thematic, topical talk today. That's not our usual practice, because we're committed to giving the congregation here the whole counsel of God, the Bible on its own terms. And that means our usual practice is to take whole books of the Bible and to work through the whole thing. And the next week we'll do the next chapter, and the next week we'll do the next chapter, so that the Bible sets the agenda, the preacher doesn't get to do his hobby horse, and nothing is left out. That's our normal practice. It's been our practice over the last year. We've looked at almost all of the book of Genesis, beginning at chapter 12, right the way through to chapter 50, and the whole of the book of Revelation. But just as a one-off today, a thematic talk before, in a couple of weeks' time, we launch into a new series going through the whole of 1 Peter. Topical series are dangerous. Topical talks are dangerous because they can be the vehicle for the preacher's hobby horse, and because they can be abused in plucking individual verses out of their context. Now, I'm going to try not to do that, and instead we're going to look at a couple of passages rather than individual verses. But all the same, I hope to put a few different Bible passages together to address this question: what is the nature of faith? And the reason I want to do that, just on this one-off opportunity we have today, is because I keep having conversations with friends, unbelieving friends particularly, and realise that they misunderstand what we mean or what the Bible means by the word faith. In fact, the word is so misunderstood, I almost wonder if it would be better to do away with the word altogether, and just as Christians to use one of the synonyms in the Bible, like to trust somebody. The word trust, I think, still has more of the biblical connotations than the word faith. So the kind of conversations I have, and maybe you've had them as well, is a conversation where somebody will say, oh, I wish I had your faith. Now, you're a kind of faith kind of person. I'm not, but I admire you. I wish I could have faith the way that you do. Wonder how you instinctively respond when someone says that. Or even more starkly, I've come across people. I was explaining some of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, Easter time. I guess many of us have had those kind of conversations. And the unbeliever who I was talking to was a bit taken aback at the idea of there being evidence. And he said, well, of course, there couldn't be too much evidence, could there? Because otherwise there wouldn't be room for faith. So his understanding of faith was that it was a subjective thing that I happen to have and he doesn't happen to have. And somehow it traded against evidence for the same territory. So if there was more evidence, then there'd be less faith. And if there was less evidence, there'd be more faith. So faith is the thing, according to my friend, that fills the gap when the evidence ends or runs out. And that somehow that's a good thing because it allows us to exercise this kind of subjective, noble quality of a leap in the dark. Maybe you've had conversations like that. I suspect you have. I think that understanding of faith is almost universal in our culture. And it's not the Bible's understanding of the term. So let me ask you, just as we begin today, what is your instinctive response when someone uses the word faith like that? I wish I had your faith. Subjective thing. Or there couldn't be too much evidence, could there? Because that wouldn't leave room for faith. The idea that faith is the thing that fills the vacuum where the evidence and the reason ends. What would be your instinctive response? Well, maybe you would say, everyone has faith in something. The question is simply what it is that you trust. Well, we're all believers by nature. The simple question is, what is it that you trust in? So the atheist trusts in the idea that the whole cosmos, as we experience it, came about entirely by chance, and that a Big Bang that happened by accident is sufficient to explain everything that we see. There's no proof of that in science, but some people prefer to believe that rather than to believe in God. So it's a kind of, I would say, a leap in faith, a leap of faith in the Big Bang and its ability to explain absolutely everything without a God. Everyone believes something. I remember hearing a sermon years ago when I was first a Christian saying everyone has faith in something. You believed in that chair when you sat on it. You experienced chairs before, but you've never experienced that particular chair on that particular day, but you just trusted that it would hold your weight. When you open a tin of baked beans, you trust that Mr. Hines will have put inside the tin what he says, and that it will contain baked beans rather than baked beans plus cyanide. And so you eat the beans without any checks. Everyone believes in something. The question is what you believe. Turn, would you, to John chapter 8. I think you see a striking confirmation of this argument. Everyone believes in something. It just depends in what you believe. John chapter 8 and verse 43. I promised I'd set these texts in their context. This is a low point in a degenerating argument between Jesus and some Jewish leaders who are increasingly hostile to him. And Jesus says this, John chapter 8, verse 43, "Why do you not understand what I say? It's because you cannot bear to hear my words. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning. He has nothing to do with the truth, because there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he's a liar and the father of lies. But because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me." Everyone believes in something, Jesus says, and the reason that you don't believe the truth is because you've already believed the lie. You believe in your father, the devil. He's a liar. You've trusted him. And so now the very truth itself seems like a lie to you. Because I tell you the truth, you don't believe me. I once tried to illustrate this, maybe a couple of you have heard this illustration, by analogy of an evil geography teacher. And this evil geography teacher decides that it would be fun to deceive her entire class by telling you that Australia is a landlocked country just to the east of France. And this, because she's an evil kind of supervillain, this geography teacher has an unlimited budget, and so she has special atlases printed for the school classroom where Australia is there just to the east of France. She is able to, with her huge budget, to commission the refilming of episodes of Neighbours and Home and Away so that everyone has a faint French accent and makes references to going to buy their baguettes across the border and that kind of thing. She even has her own fake exam board and sets you exams such that if you put something like Australia's in the Pacific, you get 0, and so on. Now imagine that you've been schooled by this teacher throughout your education, and then you meet an Aussie like David Cook, who's joining us next week, and you say, "Oh, hello, nice to see you, just across, I guess, on the Eurotunnel, was it? Just from the other side of France." He looks at you strangely and says, no, I came by plane from the southern hemisphere." What do you think when he tells you that? You think he's a liar. Because you've trusted your geography teacher who told you the lie. You see, if you've believed the lie, then the truth, when you hear it, sounds like a lie. And Jesus' point here is not that there's people of faith and people who don't have faith. His point is it depends on who you've believed. Have you believed in me, or are you already committed to believing the lies of Satan? In fact, that's the choice right at the very start of the Bible, as you'll remember. When God says one thing, and Satan says the opposite, and Adam and Eve have to decide whom they will believe. So maybe that's your answer. Everyone believes in something. The question is whom you put your faith in. That would be a biblical answer, I think. It might be that your response is to say, look, Christian faith is objective faith in the facts, faith in the evidence. It's not a leap in the dark in the absence of evidence. Rather, it's following the evidence to its logical conclusion. And that would be a good answer as well. Turn to John chapter 20. Some of you were here last week and you heard Charlie expound this. John chapter 20 and verse 30. Jesus did many other signs, it means his miracles, in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. A wise man once said that whenever you see the word therefore in the Bible, you should ask what it's there for. And the same goes for words like because or consequently or so that. Notice the so that in that verse. These testimonies of Jesus' miracles, performed in front of eyewitnesses like me, John, these are written so that you may believe. You see the causal connection? You are able to believe because of written testimony of eyewitness evidence. If there hadn't been evidence like this, presumably, you would not be able to believe. So far from this idea that there mustn't be too much evidence because that wouldn't leave room for faith. Quite the opposite. The more evidence there is, the more faith is possible. Because the Bible isn't operating with this kind of leap in the dark definition of faith. Faith simply means to trust something. And if you're a sensible, rational person, then you will trust in where the evidence leads. And of course, this comes just after doubting Thomas, who can't believe the testimony of his friends that Jesus is alive, gets evidence right up close in his face. He touches Jesus' wounds where they put the nails in. He realizes Jesus is alive again physically. He's an eyewitness and a touch witness. And because of that, he believes. And he becomes one of the witnesses who enables us to believe. Now, I think for many of us, those kind of passages are our instinctive response. Faith is an objective thing. Everyone has faith. The question is, whom do you trust? And there are very good reasons for trusting in God. And that's my answer as far as it goes. But then recently, I've realized that that is not the whole biblical answer. The idea that faith is an objective thing on the basis of evidence, well, that's true as far as it goes. But actually, again and again, I discover in the Bible that faith is also subjective. It does depend on the one who has faith, as well as the one in whom they have faith. I think what I did, I had a kind of pendulum swing reaction. I got so cross with people talking about the leap in the dark thing that I wanted to say, look, it's objective, it's true for everyone, it's nailed down, it's just external evidence. That's true. Jesus really did rise from the dead, irrespective of whether you believe that. Australia really is in the Pacific, irrespective of whether you believe that. If you happen to believe, because of an evil geography teacher, that Australia is next to France, it's still in the Pacific. It doesn't change where it is, based on your opinion about it. It's an objective location in the world. It's possible to be wrong about it, but there is a right answer. And you're sensible if you trust in what's really true, that Jesus rose, that there is a God who made us, that Australia is quite a long way away. That's true as far as it goes. And yet our ability to trust in what's objectively true, well, then it starts to depend on us and our attitude of mind, our attitude of heart. Actually, the Bible does speak about people of faith and people without it. And so when the person says, oh, I kind of admire your faith, or I wish I had your faith, there's something kind of half true about that. Because faith is a gift of God that not everyone has. Faith is a commendable thing that pleases God. Faith is even a command repeatedly in the Bible. Trust in God, that we need to do something to obey. So yes, faith Sensible faith has as its object something true and objective and external, the facts of history, and yet at the same time it is incumbent upon us to make sure we have the right attitude towards those things, to make sure that we respond in faith to what God's promised. I don't know about you, but I often miss that out in my indignant response to those kind of leap-in-the-dark assumptions. But in the Bible, faith is both objective, the object is God and there's serious evidence for him, but also subjective. Just look at Hebrews 11. I think this is a passage that puts this very, very clearly. Hebrews 11, page 1211. Hebrews 11, verse 1. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. This is very interesting. The whole point about faith in this chapter is that you can't see the thing that you trust, or that the thing that you trust is not yet. If you're into kind of logic diagrams, you can draw a 2x2 grid on your order of service. And make the columns seen and unseen, and make the rows now and in the future. And according to Hebrews 11, the faith bit concerns things that are either invisible and now, or visible and future. The one thing is that they're not are here and visible. Things that you've got to trust God for, because you can't see them. Now, William got me doing some hard work here, because he said, isn't it true, this is just William off the top of his head, said, isn't it true that in chapter 1 of, verse 1 of Hebrews 11, the word for assurance is the same as the word in chapter 1 for Jesus being the exact imprint of the nature of God. And it turned out that William was right. I thought that was quite impressive off the top of your head, Greek word knowledge. So the word is hypostasis. Faith is the hypostasis of the things hoped for. And the word in chapter 1 refers to Jesus being the hypostasis of the nature of God, the exact representation of the nature of God. And in chapter 1, that's an objective thing. Now, that doesn't by itself prove it, because the same word can be used more than once in a book, and you can use words in different ways. Words can have different shades of meaning, but it's at least interesting, gets you thinking, is faith here objective? It's in something concrete, and yet at the same time subjective, because the person exercising the faith needs to make sure that they do so. In fact, they're commended for doing so. Verse 2. By it, by faith, the people of old received their commendation. It's a good thing to trust things you can't see. It's a good thing to trust things that are in the future. And then we get a whole load of examples. For example, look at Noah, verse 7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. So here's Noah, and he's told, famously, build a huge boat and fit in it your 8 family members and lots of animals. And they all go in 2x2 or 7x7, depending if they're clean or unclean animals, and they fill this boat. But of course, at the time that Noah builds the boat, it's not raining. There's no flood. Seems a fairly ridiculous thing to do, to build a boat inland big enough to fit an entire zoo. Why ever would you do that? Well, the reason Noah does it is because God tells him to, and Noah trusts in what God says. But he trusts in what God says about something that's in the future, and at the moment he can't see. No rain, no clouds in the sky, but a promise of God. So he thinks, okay, well, that's good enough for me. I'll do what God says. And then at a time, of course, it rains, there's a flood. Noah is saved. Or look at Abraham. We've just been looking at Abraham in the book of Genesis. Abraham in verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. So again, notice it's not something that he could see. Couldn't see the future and the great multitude that would one day inhabit a land flowing with milk and honey. He just set off on a journey. Why? Because God had said so. He thought, okay, I'll trust what God says, and I'll go even though I can't see it. So is this a leap in the dark faith? Well, in some ways it is in the dark. You couldn't say, in a sense, this is faith based on the evidence of what was going to happen. You know, as if Noah did enough meteorology to independently prove by scientific means that it definitely would rain for a really, really long time. And as a result of that, he built an ark. No, he didn't have any of that kind of evidence to go on. Or as if, Abraham managed to sufficiently analyze the kind of socioeconomic and military prospects of the various peoples living in Canaan and do future predictions and work out that one day he'd be able to conquer them and they'd live there. He didn't have any of that kind of evidence to go on. So in a sense, it is trust in the absence of sight. But it's not a leap in the dark, wishful thinking kind of thing, because it's faith in a God who is faithful. And that's where the objective and the subjective come together. There is an object to the faith, God, and quite a lot of things are known about God, which mean trusting him, taking him at his word, becomes a very rational thing to do. Just notice Sarah, verse 11. By faith, Sarah received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. So the person of faith, the person who trusts in something that's invisible and not now, isn't just somebody who trusts fantasies. Now, I can think of all kinds of invisible things that I could believe in. I believe that there's a planet just the other side of Mars that's made of cheese that one day we'll take a rocket to and we'll be able to eat it. Well, I can't see that. There's no evidence for that. And so I could, by wishful thinking, by my imagination, my flight of fancy, trust in it. That is not what is being spoken of here. This is trust in someone, God, on the basis of what is known about his character. He is faithful. And therefore, a willingness to take him at his word about things for which we don't have any other source of information. No other source but God's word of the information it was going to rain and that Noah should build an ark. But God said so. He was warned by God, verse 7, and so Noah feared God and did it. No other source of information for Abraham other than God had said, and that was good enough for him, so he went. No other source of information for Sarah. I remember in her 90s that she was going to get pregnant. I mean, it seemed, if you go and ask the gynecologists, they would laugh at you. It seemed ridiculous. But God had said, and she reasoned or considered that God was faithful. Therefore, from one man, him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven. It's rational because its object is trustworthy. And no other source of information apart from God is still pretty good evidence. There is an approach, isn't there, to knowledge that says that science is the really, really sure stuff. But if science can't tell you something, well, then you might want to kind of go to other sources of information. And if you want to, I suppose you could ask God for some of the things that you can't find out yourself. Science is really sure, and then God might supply some other things by faith if you have to. This challenges us always to reverse those two. Things God says are the really, really sure things. because God knows everything in the entire universe. And science is, well, we know some things, we can find out some things ourselves, but we get them wrong. There turn out to be huge paradigm shifts in science, like the theory of relativity, that meant that most science before that was wrong. And we'll probably be wrong again. And so, we can know some things ourselves, but the things that God says are really sure. The things that God says are more certain than things that humans say, because God knows quite a lot more than humans know. And so it becomes entirely rational to take him at his word. I know we stopped our reading at verse 16, but just as I was preparing, I then thought, bother, I wish we'd read on. So can we just read on a little bit? Verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Now, you may remember this when we looked at it in Genesis. This is the instant in Abraham's life when God tells him, Genesis chapter 22, to take Isaac, his son, his only son, and to sacrifice him to the Lord. And extraordinarily, Abraham takes a knife, takes his son, and starts walking up the hill. I remember this sermon particularly well because, as you know, we're trying to do a church plant in Greenwich, and I had met that week a church warden from a church in that area, and got talking to him. We kind of got on very, very well, and he went onto our St. Helen's website and downloaded my sermon on Abraham and Isaac, and wrote me the most extraordinary email I've ever received because he was so angry. It seemed so extraordinary to preach about somebody willing to sacrifice his own son. Of course, the Bible is absolutely against the detestable practice of human sacrifice as practiced by some pagans. And yet God asks Abraham to do this as a test. It's a big test because, as you remember the backstory of Genesis, Isaac was not a child who came easily to his mum and dad. They waited for years and years and years and years. There was no sign of pregnancy, no improvement in fertility. Sarah got older and older and older and older. God kept saying, you're going to have a son. They laughed at the very idea. Isaac's name became He Laughed, because his parents thought it was absurd that God could pull this off. And then finally, they get a son. When Sarah is well past age, 90 years old, she gives birth to a son. And then God says, sacrifice your son. Your son in whom all the promises depended, your son that was so slow in coming, now you've got him, give him up. And Abraham was willing to. But notice why. Verse 19. He considered, there's that word again, he reasoned, he thought it through rationally. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. Now, it's actually quite a logical conclusion, isn't it? Because Abraham's only received this son at all because of a miracle. A very, very elderly lady, well past biological age, receiving a son almost as from the dead. That's how Romans 4 describes it. God who gives life to the dead. Here comes a child from a dead womb. So Abraham thinks, well, if he dies, God could bring him from the dead again. He's already done it once. God can obviously do miracles. I've seen God do a miracle. God could do another miracle. I don't have to work out how God will sort it out. I can trust him. That's his reasoning. Of course, it's only a test. God doesn't ask him to sacrifice his son, but he is proved faithful and commended for it. You see, faith is the subjective response to an objectively trustworthy God. It's not a leap in the dark. It is in the dark because you can't see the things that God's speaking about. You can't see that we're forgiven if we trust in Jesus. You can't see that there's a resurrection of everyone who dies trusting in him. God's told us there will be, just like he told Noah there'd be a flood, and Abraham that he'd have a son. But it's not now, and it's not visible, and so you've got to take God's word for it. But there's every reason to do so, because God is faithful. And so, like Noah, or like Abraham, or like Sarah, you can reason yourself into faith. It's a reasonable thing. He considered him faithful, who'd promised. Yeah, the logic goes something like this. God got it right before. God kept his promises before. God did the miraculous before. God raised the dead before. So even though he hasn't yet raised from the dead, those that I'm grieving, I can trust that he will. He's done it before. Even though God hasn't yet kept the promises in which I'm trusting for a new perfect creation, I can trust he will, because he's kept his promises before. She considered him faithful who promised. So it does have the objective of faith that's certain and external and true, irrespective of whether you think it's true. God is faithful even if you think he's not. Australia's in the Pacific, even if you think it's not. There is an objectivity to it. And yet, we are being urged, subjectively, to get our hearts and our minds in line with this. To imitate Abraham and Noah and Sarah and Moses and all of the others. It's a good thing to trust God. It's a commendable thing, verse 2, to trust in God. And so comes the imperative. Trust God. Put your faith in God, says Jesus, says Paul, says the Old Testament everywhere. It's something subjectively we need to do, not irrationally, but in logical, reasonable response to a God whose promises are faithful. Somebody says to you, I wish I had your faith. What's the right response? Well, yes, it's a very precious thing. It's a very precious thing to be given a trust in God, but not an irrational thing. Let me share with you why it is that I trust these things. I need to tell you about the God who's trustworthy. But you're right to envy my faith. It's a very wonderful thing to have. Or somebody says to you, it can't be too much evidence, that wouldn't leave room for faith. Well, how do you respond? No, there's every reason to trust God. In fact, it's because of the evidence that I do. But I'm prepared to take his word for things that as yet I don't have other evidence for, on the basis of his track record. She considered him faithful who promised. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the richness of your words, and thank you for the way, Lord, that different passages of your word just correct our thinking or tweak our thinking when we're going a little astray. And we praise you, Lord, that faith is an objective thing. There is real evidence that Jesus raised from the dead, a real evidence that you've kept your promises in the past. But at the same time, Lord, we realize that you're calling us subjectively to respond to you, to be prepared to take your word for things that we can't see and don't yet have. We pray that you would give us, grant us faith, increase our faith. For Jesus' sake. Amen.